Hey everybody, it's Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. We're past 1,000 episodes. We're starting to celebrate a little bit. Now, this is going to be episode 944, I believe, but we recorded for over 1,000 episodes. And if you want to hear our guest on the live side, go to YouTube, type in Pete A. Turner, Mark Sullivan, and it should come right up on YouTube. It's always great to support us there. Even if you listen on your app and that's fine, just go over to YouTube for like a minute and just hit subscribe and reminder, and that will help you know when things come out, and you can get the stuff when it comes out first. It's always going to be available here in the podcast platforms, but I think it's neat to be able to also see the live side, see Mark and I interact. Now, we don't really cut anything out. You know how it is. We keep the show pretty much as it is, but there's a benefit there for us in that we get to monetize there. So that's a big help. If you want to support us in another way, you can always go to breakitdownshow.com, hit the PayPal link, and it's in effect our own Patreon, except for we don't need Patreon between you and I. We can just do this ourselves. So Patreon would take a bigger bite than PayPal does. PayPal just takes a transaction fee. So if you're into supporting the show, want to help me out, want to see John and I get on the road and go take on some of these bigger projects, this is how you help us. It can be $5 a month. That's fine. $20 a month. Some people give one big annual thing. We've had a lot of money come in and help this way, and you'll see like the show has gotten bigger. We've gotten better equipment. We're getting more ads. These things are helping the show grow. So that is a great way to help us. Back to The Last Green Valley. Look, if you like World War II stories and impossible stories, you're going to love this one. Mark and I talk about this family that is from the area where he lives in the United States, and how they grew up in World War II, and just the impossible story that they tell. And the Mark sort of takes that story and the story of Nazi intrigue and weaves it all together into this fantastic story of survival. How do you get from here to there when everything is trying to kill you, when everybody's against you? And that's what The Last Green Valley is. Mark, in his own right, is a fantastic author. He writes with James Patterson sometimes, but he's also written, dozens of books, thrillers, and these historic fiction novels. I think you'll really, really enjoy them. I highly recommend them if you like that kind of thing at all. Mark Sullivan, great stuff. One more thing to say to you. Well, two more things, really. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. All your support is going to help veterans' lives. We're putting people out on that fishing boat. We're doing other things. We got programs coming up. The Ride for the Brave is coming up. You can get involved. Email me, Pete@breakitdownshow.com, and say, hey, Pete, I don't want to help. Or just go to savethebrave.org and chip a couple bucks in. That stuff goes a long way. We're going to get back to it now that COVID's starting to wane. Hopefully we can get out there and really do some fundraisers. Got some ideas for some stuff in Benicia. All right. One more thing to say to you, and that's this. Here comes Mark Sullivan.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Mark Sullivan. This is The Breakdown Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, you got to let it come. Yeah, sorry, I'll get it for you. The Break It Down show is proud to have Mark Sullivan on the show. It's incredible. When you're an author, you say, "Oh, I want to be an author." A lot of people have. It's a dream job, that you've got. And at some point, you get elevated above the level of needing to just sell books to survive, and you get to do things like write with some of your heroes and pick the stories a little more carefully. We've had a lot of very successful authors on the show, but I was looking at your list of books, and Mark, it's just, if no one's told you today, thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for telling these incredible stories, and congratulations on building a real steady, solid career as a writer. What's better than, it's like someone writes about you, he was a writer in Bozeman, Montana, that kind of thing, and then the adventure begins.
Yeah, it's a total miracle that I get to do this, and I'm cognizant of that every day. I wake up every day thrilled that I get to do what I do.
One of the friends of the show is a guy named Jim DeFelice. I imagine you know who Jim is, at least professionally. And I love to ask this question. He had a great answer one time. When being number one on the New York Times bestseller list is, it's one thing to say you're a bestseller. That's a whole different level. He's done the same thing. But there are day-to-day things that you do where you're like, oh, look at Mark Sullivan now. I'm doing X. Here I am, this world famous author, person. Yeah. What are those moments for you? Like when you just go, if they could see me now,
It's very humbling, really. I consistently pinch myself because I know what the odds are of getting here, and I'm grateful for it. Every day I get to get up, do exactly what I want to do. I love writing. I love being a novelist. So it's a total miracle, and I do pinch myself because I know there are a lot of really talented people out there who don't get the kind of shots that I've gotten. So.
Yeah, but you've also earned it. I mean, you don't get to have James Patterson, as a partner on a novel if you're not doing it well. What is a day in the life like for you? I mean, as you try to figure out how am I going to write this next book, are you a 16-hour iron asser, or what do you do?
I used to be. Now I'm up at 6 a.m. I meditate. I'm a big believer in meditation for creative people. I work out after that. I usually, if I'm here in Big Sky, in the winter, I'll ski for an hour, and then I come in before 11 and I lock my door. I turn off all the internet and my telephone, and I write for anywhere between 4 and 5 hours every day. And but I do it every day, 7 days a week when I'm writing. It's the only way I can sort of stay connected to the book. And that's pretty much it. I'm a really boring guy. I'll read at night, or I'll watch a movie with my wife and my kids. And I get up and do it again the same way the next day. I've found that routine is critical.
So you're less about the process and more about prepping yourself to sit down in that chair. And I guess I like to say, like, we find elegance as we get older, and we work harder or smarter, not harder. I mean, you're still working hard,
yes,
but you realize the focus can't be 100% 16 hours in the chair kind of focus.
No, I think that's necessary when you're a young writer, just to get it and to get into that space where you're really producing well. I know how to get there. And this is, it's just by routine. I know that if I meditate, if I work out, if I spend some time outside, it usually leads to a really good writing session. And the crazy thing is, things that used to take me 10 to 15 hours a day now take me 4 to 5. And you're exactly right. You learn to work smartly versus just showing up and spending a lot of time in the chair.
Right. And a lot of redrafting and redraft. Not that you probably don't have to rewrite things, but you're a lot closer to the final product when you start now, I'm assuming.
Yes, I am, because I do a lot of outlining. I think a lot about the book before I start. So by the time I'm actually writing, I'm trying to be the best writer I can. I've already worked out the drama and the storytelling.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I want to back up a little bit. You write a lot of different kinds of books. You use history, you do thrillers. Do you have a preference between fiction and nonfiction? Like, do you have a home genre? It seems like you move around quite a bit. Do you have a home genre?
Well, I'm always a fiction writer these days, unless I'm writing for a magazine. The historical fiction allows me to take, actual true events and true people and write about them in a very dramatic way, which I love doing. Up till Beneath a Scarlet Sky, which was my most recent book, I was writing thrillers and mystery novels, and I love every single one of them. But to write the historical fiction, I had to take my writing in a completely different direction. It was a huge challenge, but I found out I'm pretty good at it, at making the past come alive. And I really enjoy that. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And
what's the source?
The storytelling skills definitely come from writing mysteries and thrillers, because you have to be efficient. You can't dawdle. You got to take people in as quickly as you can. And I found that training really helped me with historical fiction.
When you look at a story like, let's just take your current. Well, no, we'll go back one book, and Under the Scarlet Sky. This is based on an actual person who is still alive. Are you still alive, right?
Yeah, he's still alive. Lello, he'll be 93 on June 1st.
I'd love to talk to that guy on the show if he's still capable of doing that. We can link that up or not. But it's just these incredible people, and so often in stories, we use Nazis as like the universal heel for all things. But you don't seem to be willing to kind of, it's become tropey. Look, Nazis are horrible. We don't want to celebrate them at all. But, they become this mythic bad guy. And you're kind of using this, especially in your current book, The Last Green Valley. You don't use them in that traditional way. Like this is a man against the machine kind of story, I think, in both cases.
Yes, that's true. And, I'm of the belief that no one is purely evil. I mean, there are probably exceptions, a handful in history. But people who are good people do bad things. And that's what I've been playing with, with these characters who are, based on real people. But I was able to introduce them and talk to them and find their relatives enough to find out that they had different sides to their personalities, right? General Layers, who's the antagonist of sorts in Beneath the Scarlet Sky, he's aptly named. He has layer after layer after layer. Some are good, some are bad. And I think that's one of the strengths of the story. The same thing in The Last Green Valley. The Nazis are complicated. Some of them are quite bad. The character of the captain in the book, The Last Green Valley, I mean, he was an actual Holocaust perpetrator in the Ukraine. He was part of what was called the Holocaust of Bullets, which is, I didn't understand this, that the final solution really started when Hitler invaded Russia. Everything before then had been set up to go in that direction. And they originally started just by having firing squads. And then they found out that they couldn't handle the volume with firing squads, and they moved on.
Yeah, they moved on. And it's, again, like when you're like in The Last Green Valley, and I guess we talk about that now, but when you're between two machines, you're in a rock and a hard place. You don't trust either of them bastards. You've got to make so many, like I'm a combat veteran, and there's so many times where you don't even just make a decision. You don't have the time and the luxury to figure out what's the best choice. You just have to act, because there's no time for sorting that out.
And that's exactly what happens to the Martels, who are the protagonists of The Last Green Valley. And were real people. I know their sons very well and was able to interview them at length. And I lucked out that I had, there were recordings of them being interviewed, and I was able to listen to all that and work with them. But right at the beginning of the book, which takes place in March of 1944, they're faced with this terrible decision. Do they stay in the Ukraine, where their family has been living for over 100 years as ethnic Germans brought there to sow and harvest wheat for Catherine the Great? Do they stay? Because after the Bolsheviks came, they got thrown off their land. They were starved. They were treated horribly. And then Hitler invades and says, "Do you want your land back?" And they said, "Sure." And so they work on it for about 18 months until Stalin counterattacks. And when Stalin counterattacks, they know that they're in trouble, because they'll probably be sent to Siberia, if not hung. So they have this choice. Do they stay and wait for the Soviet bear to return, or do they run with the Nazis they've come to despise, but who have promised to keep them safe? And so they run with the Nazis, with their intent is they're going to break off from them at some point and try to get to the Allied lines. So it's one of the more amazing stories I've ever heard. And I loved writing it. It was tremendous challenge and fun, and all in the same day.
Do you have to go to Ukraine and these other places to kind of get talk about that.
I retraced this. Yeah. So I retraced their migration route, which they did in a covered wagon, by the way, with 2 horses and 2 kids and everything they could shove in the wagon. And they take off on what's essentially a 1,400-mile journey. And they're caught between the 2 armies. And so I went and retraced that route. I started in Ukraine with the brothers, who are still alive, and we were able to track back to the ruins of the farmhouse where the story begins. And that was incredible for them to see the whole cycle of their life right in front of them, to know that they had run when they were 4 and 6, and they remembered it. And then we were able to go to the Gulag, where their father was held, and to see them go into the basement of this museum where they were held as prisoners of war was just incredible for them, because he went into that gulag with 2,000 other men, and when he escapes, there are only 200 left, and he knows he's going to die because the thing is rampant with disease, and he makes this remarkable move and escapes. And I was able to track all that through. I went from Ukraine through Moldova, Romania, Hungary, up to Poland, and then backtracked back all the way to the border with Belarus, where Mr. Martel was held. And it really gave me a sense of the epic scope of what they had gone through,
We often focus on Western Europe in most of our European knowledge, and we'll attribute, a lot of things just to the English as a default. It's they get the most notoriety, so that they get everything. But when you get to Eastern Europe and you see that people still use a donkey and a cart, granted there's car tires on that cart now, but if you think about that, like we sort of have that here with the Amish, but this is a way of life for everybody in, not everybody, but lots of people in Romania, in the Baltic states, in the Balkans. It's a different world, and it's very same as it was 100 years ago.
Well, you can see the effects of communism everywhere there. There's a drabness to the architecture. But once you get out into the countryside, you do see people who are living the same way the Martels lived, with some obvious improvements like rubber tires and things of this nature. Right. And it really gave me a sense of the vastness of Ukraine. When you see it, especially from the air, you just realize it's all agriculture, right, outside of the big cities. And it's one of the big bread baskets of the world. And so you can see why everybody valued it, from Catherine the Great to Stalin to Hitler. They all wanted it because they knew that that was where the food was coming from. And you couldn't expand into these areas of a greater Germany or an expanding, Soviet Union. They needed it. If they didn't have it, their people were going to starve.
When you talk to the family and other folks in Ukraine, how do they perceive their history? I mean, it's like the Balkans, where everybody runs through it on the way to somewhere else, right? It becomes this resource because they are valuable. How do they perceive what does it mean to be Ukrainian?
Oh boy, I don't know. I think it was interesting. The women there were uniformly sharp and well-rounded, and they loved the modern Ukraine. A lot of the men I met, they were sort of bitter. Some of them, including my guide, he said he was better off under communism, which really surprised me. That you have to remember also that there was a massive brain drain out of that part of the world, because Stalin and Lenin, they basically, if you opposed them, they shipped you to a gulag, or they killed you. And like Mrs. Martel's father was taken when she was 12, never heard from again, vanished. Mr. Martel's father was also sent to Siberia, and he did manage to come back, but he was a broken person. So it's a very conflicted place, is what I guess I'm saying. The history of it is conflicted because there's a lot of bitterness and regret there. And at the same time, young people, they love it because it's come out of that world and it's making progress constantly.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the Martels having to make that choice. You were always stuck between the Russians and the Germans, at least from their point of view, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, you have to leave your homeland, and you may never. It's war. You may never come back. You may not want to come back, but you have to leave everything. And so I guess the Allies are the best bet. But are the Allies as benevolent as we want them to be, as the main tent pole in the Allied tent, or is this better than nothing?
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit of better than nothing, because remember, the Soviets were part of the Allied forces, and there was a pinch, but they knew what life was like under communism, and they wanted out, and they were running. So they were going to take any possible way to get out of the way of the Soviet bear, and they ran with the wolves. And it's like anything from that period, when you start digging into it, it gets really complicated. It gets morally murky almost immediately. And I think to their great credit is they realized that it was their only chance. And so they basically cut all ties to their land and they ran. What's amazing to me, obviously, is how they can go through this incredibly brutal journey and then be separated, and the husband and wife separated, and then go on another brutal journey, each of them alone. Mom with the 2 boys and dad in the gulag that he has to escape from. And the fact that he makes it all the way to the British sector, only to find out that she's on the wrong side of the line. She's in the Soviet sector. And so she has to escape with the boys. And when I heard this story, I was just dumbfounded, because the Martels are very successful people. Once they got to the United States and once they got to Bozeman, Montana, where I live, like literally everything they touched turned to gold, because, and I attribute it directly to how hard they worked. I mean, in their early life, they worked incredibly hard just to survive, right? And they did this all the time. They get to the United States where there's opportunity and they're working just as hard, right? But all of a sudden, the rewards of their hard efforts start to come.
Yeah.
And I think it's an incredibly inspiring story. And it's an amazingly American story, right? This is a story of people who America brought in, who basically accepted them and gave them a new life as refugees. And boy, what they did once America gave them the chance was just remarkable.
How exceptional are the Martels from the World War II era? I mean, are there thousands of families like this? I mean, I know they're not singular. There's no way.
No, there are thousands and thousands just like them. People who are ethnic Germans who lived in Eastern Europe, who they were expulsed by all the countries, including the Soviet Union, including Poland. All these places expulsed them. So like at one point, about a year after the war ends, roughly 20, not even a year, like 4 months after the war ends, 20 million Germans start walking to Germany. And Germany couldn't keep them. There was no room for them. Some of them settled in Germany, but a lot of them went to Canada, went to the United States, went to South America. But yeah, it's amazing how many people were uprooted and moved around because of World War II. And, that's what really fascinated me about the Martel story is I was less interested in telling a war story than I was telling a story about a family trying to get out of the way of a war. Yeah. Right? They had no stake in the thing. They were just trying to get out of the way. And I found that fascinating, and I was able to depict that thing that way in a meaningful way, I think.
When you did this, so we had a guy named Lou Bashesky on, and his grandpa rode in a tank from Normandy all the way until the end. Like he just kept going, and their tank survived. That's pretty remarkable. And so he went out on Lou, his grandson, went on his bicycle and followed that path through Europe. And his grandpa remembered a story where late in the night, they're in the field and a cow steps on a mine, kaboom, and the cow blows up. And he's like, it was this crazy thing. His cow dies. And so he goes through and he finds a lady by happenstance. Actually, she finds him. And she's like, well, one thing I remember is that our cow got blown up in this field. And he has this impossible confluence of things where you're like, oh my God, they remember the same moment. It's his grandpa come back to life. Mm-hmm. Did you have anything like that where you're like, how in the world,
Yeah, I did. I met this guy in Romania, right on the border with Moldova. And at the time he was like 96. He's 100 now. He's still alive.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, amazing. He was the beekeeper. He had a heavy influence on the book because he was one of the more enlightened people I've ever met in my life. He had just this extraordinary connection with me immediately, and I could feel it. And he started telling me about, he was a Romanian soldier, and he was on the border when the ethnic Germans came through. He remembered it, and then the Romanian government flipped sides, right? They were with the Germans against the Soviets, and yet they turned And now all of a sudden they're with the Soviets because he can see the writing on the wall. So he's told to surrender. And when he goes to surrender, they take him and throw him in a prison camp. And he spends 4.5 years in a prison camp, escapes 3 times, and finally gets sent to a maximum security camp. And he manages to come out with this dream that he holds on to, which is of being a beekeeper. And that's what his obsession was. He was fascinated by bees. He was convinced that bees would give him a long life, which they did. He's over 100 years old and he's still sharp, which was just incredible. So there was that. And that was fortuitous because before Mr. Martel goes into the gulag, he's the kind of guy who doesn't want to be noticed, right? He's grown up under the communist regime, and he knows that if you stick out or if you excel at something, you're probably going to get sent away. And so he becomes the kind of guy who doesn't want to be noticed and very, very little ambition other than surviving. But he goes to the camp and he escapes. And when he escapes, he's a different person, right? He sees opportunity everywhere. He takes risks constantly. And this carries through not only the long escape, because he had to go all the way back to Germany, right? He got sent back farther than he started, and he has to make it all the way back, which he does. And from that point forward, he's a total entrepreneur. And the boys couldn't explain it. And they said, you're going to have to explain it. So the way I explained it is he meets somebody very much like, Corporal Georgi. And that man changes his life.
When you have this much improbable survival, they have to be strong religious people. Like, there's no way that they don't think the hand of God was on them all the time. I mean,
absolutely.
You're bound to it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there are people of profound faith and deep faith that was tested, right? All the time during this thing. So at one point, he's lost his faith, and at another point, she's losing her faith. But they managed to cling to the last shreds of it, and it turns out. And because of that, they became, incredibly devout. She especially, Adeline especially, she was a profoundly faithful Lutheran. She went to church all the time in Bozeman, and she basically said, without God, they never would have made it.
You think about that today, and we're so godless, and there's, we're so in charge of our destiny. I don't know that we have the moments that, have some fear of God, to have some spiritual responsibility. It just left us to our own devices, to leave me alone. And I don't know that the Martels would recognize that. Like, if they were young right now, and you transported them in a time machine, I wonder how they would deal with all of that. Or would they just keep working and not worry about it? I don't know.
I think they would keep working. I don't think they would worry about other people's faith. They're very independent minded. I know that their grandchildren are very religious, still are Lutherans, and Walter's son, especially Charlie. So it was passed down, and all the grandkids remember their grandparents as being incredibly faithful people.
Same true for Pino. Is he also, because his survival is so, impossible?
Pino is an interesting guy. I would describe him as a spiritual person that's not very religious. He realizes that a lot of his life, especially during the 2 years of the war, were a miracle. Some of it was brutal miracle, but it was a miracle nonetheless. And he taught me a lot about how we deal with tragedy as human beings. Everybody has to go through it, and grief. And it was always that you get through it by recognizing that the only thing that happens is change. It's constant. And the more you embrace that, and you're grateful for the people who come into your life and grateful for the people who exit your life, it's the best way to live your life in the long run. And that's what I learned from him. He changed my life profoundly. And the Martel story did too, because I saw again and again and again in their story that they never gave up. They just never gave up. And that alone will get you a long way in life. And all the lessons that I got from Pino Lella were certainly reinforced by the Martel story.
How does Pino reckon with the fact that he works for one of the top Nazis? How does that? I mean, he's not a Nazi, right? He's there not by choice. No. He's there because of war. But how does he deal with that?
Well, he suffers with it, right? He almost loses his best friend because he thinks he's gone Nazi. He's doing it because his parents were convinced he was going to be sent to the Russian front and he was going to die, and they didn't want him to die for the Germans. So they had him volunteer for an organization, the organization Todt, which is the least understood part of the Nazi war machine. It was like a combination of the Quartermaster's Corps and the Army Corps of Engineers. They built stuff. They commandeered stuff. They ran the factories. They were in charge of war production is what their title was. And, he sort of blunders into it. His parents make him volunteer because they know he's going to be put in a non-combat role. And then through a series of remarkable circumstances, he becomes this general's driver. Now, Pino is an amazing driver. I can attest to that myself, having driven with him. Scared the bejesus out of me within 20 minutes of meeting him, driving through the streets of northern Italy in his car. And that became, crucial because, if you've read the book, he's an amazing driver, and I can attest that he is an amazing driver. So he gets the job with the general by a fluke, and all of a sudden he's going with this guy everywhere, seeing what the Germans are building and able to pass that information on to the partisans through his uncle and the radio that they had, and it got out to the Allies. So he was very divided on working for the general. He can tell you as many stories about the general where he was bad as when he was good. So it depends on the day when I would talk to him. Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? And the truth is he was both.
Yeah, like everybody, right? We had one of the moms from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was on the show. Her name's Vivian. And I mean, that's her show name, but Daphne's her real name. She was saying, Bill Cosby is my friend. He's done so much for the Black community, especially in Hollywood and in around the nation. However, he's also done these horrible things. But, you have to balance this good and evil. And it's never just boom. Like you said earlier, it's never just one thing.
It's never just
the same thing goes true for Saddam Hussein. We had a guy named Kelly Heiler, and he was the personal jailer for Saddam Hussein, going through the trial. And his job from the American side, from an international side, was to keep him calm, go through the process without a whole lot of drama and drawing attention to himself. So keep him chilled out. Let's get this over with,
Right.
And he's like, Saddam was my friend. I cried when he died. I also know what kind of a monster he was, and so you have this conflicting thing because we want someone to be just universally bad, but you have a guy like Layers, and it depends on the day, depends on the moment.
Depends on the moment. I mean, ultimately people have asked me, what do I think motivated Layers? And I think it was undoubtedly Layers. He was looking out for himself at all times. And, he was trying to make sure that he was going to go back home to his family, which is, you can't argue with that, right? I mean, that's just the basic human condition. But I don't think people are all one way or another, despite what social media will have you believe these days, where somebody is all one thing. If they've done one thing, it's their life, they're canceled, it's over. And, first of all, our legal system doesn't work that way. And neither should, the court of public opinion, in my belief.
Yeah, when we deal in doubt, reasonable doubt, we don't deal in hard truths hardly ever. Those things typically don't go to trial. If you know, you know.
Yeah.
The thing with Layers is he survives and gets through Nuremberg and all that stuff too, right?
He doesn't even get to Nuremberg. He's jailed and he's waiting trial. And then because of a number of societal and global factors, largely it had to do with the fact that the historians believe that people were just sick of the war by the time the 2 years of the Nuremberg trials were going on. And when they were getting ready to do the Italian trials, there was a number of other things because Italy was starting to trend communist. And people believed that if they put these things on trials, it would only strengthen the communist hands. Were there trials in Italy? Yeah, there were a few, but not what there should have been, because there were atrocities that went on all over Italy during the Nazi occupation.
Did Pino have any interaction with General Leyers after the war?
No, he had no idea what happened to him after that final scene on the Brenner Pass. I went and found his granddaughter, or his daughter, and was able to talk to her briefly, because she was very ill when I talked to her. But I was able to talk to his aide and to his minister, and they were able to give me a lot of interesting information about him. He was very much involved in his town and contributed to it. He had an estate. No one really knew where all the money came from that he used to restore it. His wife had inherited it, but they lived there, and he ends up building a church in the town. And there are all sorts of things about him that, again, are incredibly positive. And yet, he did run a slave army in Italy. There's no doubt about it. So, how do you judge those two things? And one of the ways he said is, and I got this from either the aide or the minister, I can't remember, is that, he believed in being the man behind the scenes. He did not want to be out front. He wanted to be pulling the levers of power without, being out front, because being out front like that gets you killed. And he didn't want that.
And the same thing applies, standard Nazi caveat applies here too, but the same thing applies for a guy like Leyers, is that he is a man in a situation, the war starts and he's high enough ranked that, your opportunity to leave is very limited. And then just because you leave doesn't mean that you survive the walk across the lines. And then also when you interact with the Americans, you're as likely to get shot as surrendered and safely transition. I mean, you don't know. And so you're trying to decide your best bet. It doesn't forgive the atrocity, but like everybody else, they're all trying to get through the next 20 minutes. I mean, I've been to combat. There's people that are like, every day I was worried that I was going to die. Every moment, I was looking for something that was coming so I could react to it. That's true for everybody in those situations. Sure. I mean, near the end of the war, I mean, he's going to Switzerland all the time. We don't know who he was meeting with. We know that, from Pino's perspective, he was smuggling gold into Switzerland. His bank accounts were frozen in the immediate post-war, but then unfrozen about 3 years later, which allowed him access to the money, which we have no idea how it got there. Pino will tell you how he got there, but do we have exact information on how it was there? No. But yeah, he's a super complicated character, and certainly the most challenging character I've ever had to write, just because I wanted to give you a broad view of him. There were other things about him that didn't make it into the book, because at a certain point, the book was like 850 pages long. And, it came to the point where if Pino wasn't there, it didn't go in the book. Right. So there's evidence that Leyers helped a musician in Venice, who was Jewish. He helped him, get to safety. There's some evidence that he was involved in prison swaps, that he was told to kill partisans. He didn't do it. Instead, swapped them with so he could get back his own prisoners. But again, Pino wasn't there, so it ended up on the cutting room floor. What about things that don't make it into The Last Green Valley? Are there things like that as well? Well, I had to truncate certain things, right? Because to my mind, the real book ends when they're reunited, and that everything after that is just explaining what happened to them after their great journey. So I didn't go into the blow by blow of what they had to go through to get into America, right? Because they had to have sponsors and to be willing to bring them and put them to work. And it's a little bit in there, but I didn't go into the nuance of it. So it's truncated toward the end. So you're getting a sense of, what happened to them in the long flow of their life afterwards. So some of that stuff ended up on the floor, certainly. when you're using fiction to help the story along, I mean, you're doing so much work on the historical side, but you say based on and historical novel. This indicates that you're using a little bit of license to make the story, even
Sure.
better. But how do you sprinkle that in?
So the first thing I have to do is recognize that, like with Beneath the Scarlet Sky, and similarly with The Last Green Valley, how are you going to recreate conversations from 60 and 70 years ago? You're just not. So that has to be fictional. You know what the intent of the conversation was, so that's fictional. I tend to cut out the slack parts, which are part of any life, and bring it to the head. So, you're seeing the Martels at their moments of greatest challenge in that book. There are times where you see them at family life, etc. But the fact of the matter is that their life was so intense during that time. You have to write in a way that gives the reader an incredibly strong sense of how that must have felt. My goal when I write historical fiction is to put the reader right on the shoulders of the main characters and to let them experience what they experienced on the page, right? They're getting it. They're getting the story, and they're feeling the emotions that these people went through and the incredible trials that they went through, right? And that's what my goal is always, is to try to show you people who lived a story that is inherently inspirational, right? Moving, perhaps healing, and perhaps transformational to the reader. And that's what I was after, because I'll give you an example. After I wrote Beneath the Scarlet Sky and it was published, and, I was blessed to have it become a runaway bestseller, people said, you'll never find another story like that. And I was like, no, I actually think I will, and then sure enough, the stories started coming out of the woodwork. All people writing me like, write about this, write about my grandmother, write about my great uncle. He did this. And they were all fascinating, but I realized I was going to have a filter. What was I looking for? And I went back and really thought about Beneath the Scarlet Sky. And I said, the reason it has impacted so many people is that the story is inherently moving. It's inspirational. It's healing. And it transformed me, and it's transformed lots of people around the world, which is incredibly gratifying, So I looked for that kind of story. That was the filter: moving, inspirational, healing, transformational, to the reader. And I was hearing stories that almost got there, but they just didn't take it. And then I'm at I'm giving a talk at the Noontime Rotary in my hometown in Bozeman, Montana. And this guy comes up afterwards and he says, do you know who the Martels are? And they own a big construction company in Montana. And I said, well, I know who they are, but I don't know them. Yep.
Yeah.
And he said, the whole time I was reading Beneath the Scarlet Sky, all I could think of was the Martel story. You have to hear it. 2 days later, I put Bill Martel's address in my nav, and it's like 2 miles from my house. And then I drive down and it tells me to take a left into this little neighborhood, and I get this bizarre feeling, and I couldn't put my finger on it until I get to Bill Martel's driveway, and I realize I can't be 250 yards from where I heard Pino Lella. It's the same little neighborhood, and I knock on the door, and Bill invites me in, and within 10 minutes I'm sitting forward in my chair, and within an hour I know I'm doing it. It's what I was looking for. It had that, quality of showing you what the human spirit is capable of. And, in this day and age, given what we've all gone through in the past year, I think we need to hear more of these stories, not less of them.
I totally agree.
It's easy to go.
Yeah.
It's easy to go to the stories that are inherently depressing and that, are awful and there's no redeeming value to them. But I find that the stories of the people who go through this and don't break, who hold on to their spirit, who rely on it, that's the kind of story I want to hear. And so those are the kinds of stories I want to write.
Yeah, because humans are incredible. And you can say whatever you want about social this or whatever that. I believe in people, and I believe that you deserve your shot, and you may not make it. Heck, you may die because you take that shot. But
Yep.
the Martels are just one of millions of examples of people coming to this great country. I saw a story on 60 Minutes about a contract company that focuses on kids with autism. And I mean, they're functional, but this is severe autism. But what they're
Yep.
great at is focusing at a level that someone who doesn't have autism isn't able to do. So they're able to give them these complex tasks, but they're you can be autistic and come here and make six figures, go do that in
100%.
a lot of other countries. And it's just not possible. You really can outwork 99% of your problems in most cases. And that's an incredible opportunity. And I'm glad that you tell these stories, because we have this perception of ourselves that we don't like immigrants, and it's far from the truth. Like I always say my favorite American is
We're
the
all
next
immigrants. Yeah, exactly. And, these are the people the immigrants are the ones who come, and they have faced unreal adversity to get here.
Right.
And what do they do when they get here? They put their back into it, and they work phenomenally so that their children gets the American way of life. And I don't know, I can't help but applaud anybody who takes the risk to flee a life that's horrible to try to make a better life. And, that is the story of the Martels. And ultimately, it's the story of an ancestor of every single one of us who's lucky enough to live here. My own ancestor came from Ireland to Canada down into Vermont, started a life, was volunteered as part of the Union Army in the Civil War, ends up dying at the Battle of Baton Rouge, but has 7 kids, and his wife raises them all, and they yield my family.
Yeah,
which is just incredible.
It is incredible. What's also incredible, and I believe this is still true, President Tyler has living grandkids, not great grandkids, grandkids. And so that's how young this country is. And you look at how remarkable it can be. We're talking 3 generations. Granted, it's really long lifetimes with, extremes but those 2 dudes are still around. There's 2 of them, not just 1, 2. And so that's how short the history is here. It's just a couple of lifetimes, and you get all the way back to he was president. Those guys were around when Andrew Jackson was president.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. William Henry Harrison, right? That guy was, his dad signed the Declaration of Independence. That's how young of a country you are, and Tyler took over for Harrison, right? So it's crazy. Yeah. I wanted to talk about back into the main book here, not Beneath the Sky, but The Last Green Valley. When you look at that story, is that the last World War II story for you, or do you think that there's something else out there? And I want to say this before you answer. I went to the World War I museum, and for some reason it doesn't stick like World War II. But I asked some of the people that work there, I'm like, how many stories are in this place? And they're like, oh my God. It's a worldwide war, the love letters, the stories, all this stuff, the archives. Yeah. Like you could tell stories about World War I forever.
Yes. So I could tell stories about World War I and probably World War II forever. But my criteria is I want stories that are inherently moving, inspirational, healing, transformational. And I've been looking since The Last Green Valley, and another story showed up, and it's not World War II. It takes place in Uganda. It's the story of a 13-year-old boy and an 12-year-old girl who get kidnapped by a guy named Joseph Kony, and they're turned into child soldiers. And it's horrendous what they go through, and yet they meet after 5 years. They're in different parts of this Lord's Resistance Army, and they fall in love. And by falling in love, they manage to survive and then escape. And it's just an incredible story. And it was brought to me by a former commander of SEAL Team 6, who is a friend of my son's. And he said, I've got a story for you. And as soon as I heard it, I was like, okay, it meets all the criteria. I've never heard a story like it. and I'm going to go do it. And so I'm going to Uganda in about 6 weeks to spend a month with them. They're still alive, and of course, and I can't wait. I think it's going to be a tremendous story.
We have such a small bit of knowledge about boy soldiers and what it's like to live in Africa. I know people from different special forces elements that have gone there and dealt with that, and they're like, they're me. They parents were both dead. They were left to their own devices. The military came along and said, "Here's how we're going to do this, and this is how they survive," and they become something.
Yes.
And it's easy to swap uniforms, and all of a sudden you're them. It's that understanding, and that's the thing I learned in combat is like people. You have to accept people for where they are and how they got there, because you just can't put your own morals and norms on them, because it's not fair to them, and it wouldn't be fair for them to do it to you, especially if you're trying to change what they're doing. You have to understand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our friend, the SEAL team commander, he told me that these kids were trained harder than any SEAL.
Yeah.
He said, I don't think I could have done it, what they went through at their age. And, what they had to do to survive, because of course they're told immediately that their parents are dead.
Yeah.
Which was not true in this situation. It was not true. Some of them were killed by the armies and the kidnappers, but Florence and Anthony were not dead. They didn't know this for years. They had convinced them that their parents were dead. And yet the amazing thing about them is they managed to hold on to their humanity the entire time. Yeah. They don't turn into zombies. And a lot of it is by faith. They're Catholics, both of them, and they managed to hold on to their faith. And then when they met each other and fell in love, that became their strength. And that became the thing that gets them out, is by basically becoming more human, not less. That's how they survive.
That's remarkable. And you're right. The every SEAL I think I've talked to said they got through BUDS because they were willing to die to do it. And so if they think what these other African soldiers are doing is similar, then they're all willing to live to do it. Like this is how they live, and it doesn't matter what you throw at them, and they're either going to die or not, and you lose control of that, and you just work, and you're not out there bloodlusting, at least not initially. You might get there, but that's a different story. I love it. I want to take John Terz's question and throw this at you. John wants to know if Mark has any advice or suggestion for potential writers. I mean, you're so far up Rider Mountain and so successful. How do you get up the lower part of the foothills of the mountains?
The first thing is to make it your craft that you practice every day. The number one thing I tell writers who come up to me and ask, or aspiring writers, is I always tell them, spend the same amount of time every day writing, even if it's only an hour. Do it. Show up every day. And that alone will get you a long ways. The other thing I tell them to do is study the books you love. Read them once. If you find out you loved them, go back and read it again, but dissect it. Ask yourself how the writer told the story and really study it, and then learn from that. And then read another one that you love, but read it to dissect it. Very few people take this advice. Very few. The people I know who have taken it are now going to be published writers, including my oldest son. He actually did it. And the other thing is, do it the same time of day, write at the same time of day every day, and write in the same place as much as you can, and make that place its own place, isolated. I know people who write in closets because they need the isolation. Yeah. And it doesn't seem to matter if you're a novelist or a joke writer or a comedian or whatever. Yeah. It's all the same. There's a great interview with Jerry Seinfeld, and he talks about, they said, what's the number one reason you were successful? He goes, I write every day. Yeah. That's what he does. And he does it at the same time, and he meditates, because, being by yourself, writing alone is not good for your mental health. So meditate to get, the boogeyman out of there, and go to work. Same time, same place, every day when you're writing. Yeah. by all means take time off. But that's it. That's the number one piece of advice I can give you.
So if you want to work as a writer, work as a writer. Like,
that's
do
correct.
It. No, just get
do
out
it
there and get after it. Man, I love this. One of the things I want to just kind of examine, when I'm talking to someone, I'm interviewing, as a spy, right? I'm talking to people in real time in their space, and I'm trying to understand what truth is and what's fiction for them. Not that they're trying to lie to me, but I really want to understand it because then I can relay that back to the commander. And I find that when they get emotional, when I get them in the headspace and they can describe clearly, a moment, like you were talking earlier about just combat, and you skip the moments in between, like when they're going from point A to point B. But there's times along that trail where you stop and everything is crystal clear, and you're not in a combat zone. You're looking at a red-breasted robin, and you can remember that robin down to the finest detail into that thing.
Sure.
Do you look for these moments too, where you see the person actually time machine to that location and time?
I do.
And then what I would do is I would stop and go, give me everything you see and feel and smell and everything.
That's exactly what I do. And I'm looking for mostly what the emotional center of that scene is.
Yeah.
And so I believe that if they're noticing certain things, they're noticing it because they're in a specific emotional state. And so you can write about it as a reflection of that state, right? So if she sees a beautiful scene, she's seeing it almost as there's situations in the book where it's like it's an escape, right? She can see the beauty in something, and it's escape from the terrible ordeal they're going through. But that is what humans are for. We're constantly looking for it if we're looking for it. And sometimes you're just taken by a thing. There's a scene in the book that I love where she watches this leaf just kind of tumbling along the ground, and it becomes like a metaphor for their entire existence, that they're getting blown around by history here, and yet they have their dreams, and they still manage to get all the way to the end.
Well, it's just remarkable. Everybody should get The Last Green Valley, and also don't forget to don't skip on Beneath a Scarlet Sky. These are both incredible stories. When do you think you'll have the African story ready to go?
It's due next year in May, so it'll probably be published 2 years from right now.
Okay. Well, I'd love to have you back on to talk about that. It sounds like such a fascinating book, and everybody should definitely check out. Look, anything that Mark does. I mean, he's incredible. But these two books that we profiled here today, I think, are just incredible. And thanks you for writing them. Thank you for telling these stories and giving us some humanity, and also showing us, that if you've been through something like World War II, coming to America and working hard on your dream, that's cake.
That's cake.
So cake.
Life here is cake.
Yeah.